Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's London Ballet Circle in Conversation. Our guest tonight is the multi-talented Andrew McNicol. Many of you will have seen his work over the past few years. He's had commissions from all over Britain and internationally as well. He's also started the McNicol Ballet Collective, which is a wonderful company, and members of LBC were treated to a morning at the, excuse me, at the McNicol Ballet Collective just recently, and it was a very, very well-received visit. So tonight we get to meet Andrew and find out about the man behind the choreography and also what his plans are for the upcoming work he's doing. And also tonight, Deborah Weiss is here to run the interview for us. So if you want to ask a question of Andrew, please type it into the chat box. That's at the bottom of your screen. And please give your first name. And now I would like to hand over to Deborah and Andrew for tonight's In Conversation.
Good evening. Hi, Andrew.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. I'm just going to jump in at the deep end and take you right back to your early days. And I think I'm right in saying that you were born in Hull. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And probably you started dancing locally there. You've just told us that your brother was a footballer. So clearly it wasn't a family thing. After you had done your local dancing training, you ended up at the Royal Ballet School. Tell me a bit about your time there. And also, that was, in a sense, the thing that sparked your interest in choreography.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Royal Ballet School, when I first went there, was such a different world than what I knew. And, my family don't come from a theatre or arts background. So it was really like this whole world that, to be honest, we didn't know really existed. And I remember during the audition for White Lodge, and, you go through Richmond Park and you go past all of the deer and you see this, amazing building. And it really was just completely a different world. But it was an incredibly special time because I think, I had gone from sort of training locally and driving around the country to do as many classes as possible to going to a school that was sort of built and designed for giving the best kind of dance education. And for me, what was so amazing was to be in a class full of 9 or 10 other boys who were also interested in doing the same thing that I was doing. And up until that point, I was either the only boy in the class or one or two. So it was amazing to just be around other people who were interested. But there's an intensity that comes with dance training, which is brilliant on the one hand, and then choreography kind of became this outlet for me. And it really felt like it was a way to break the rules. So at the Royal Ballet School, they do the competition every year. So I just entered just to sort of create, and I won 1 year, and that's the thing that sort of gave me the confidence to do more. And I just loved being in the studio with colleagues, making something that didn't yet exist, and the unknown, the journey of that was, I find, incredibly compelling. And that's what kicked everything off, really.
So actually, you sounded a bit surprised when you said, I won 1 year. I mean, obviously, the intention when you started was to do this creation. It wasn't just to win the prize.
Yeah, it felt like a way to sort of break the rules and to let off a little bit of steam, and just build something that didn't exist. So that's what was sort of in my mind. And that thing of trying, you often have images or ideas in one's mind. It's like how to get that out and to work with my colleagues at the time to figure that out. I loved it, absolutely loved it.
So once you'd had this success, did you already start thinking, I think this is the route I want to go down? Or what did you still feel, first I want to perform for 5 years or whatever?
So it wasn't until much later. I mean, it sounds so stupid saying it now, but honestly, it wasn't until much later that I realized that people did that as a career. I didn't know that. I didn't really understand at that time that choreography could be a thing that you do as a career and sort of make your living from. That came a little bit later, sort of around when I was around 18. And through that period, through that training, I'd sort of gone away thinking I wanted to become the best dancer. But by the time I finished and was then graduating, I realized that what I loved the most was being in the studio making, more than kind of being on stage myself or exploring my own instrument and capabilities. I found much more pleasure and enjoyment in that conversation with others and that exchange with others. And so it was only at that point that I was like, okay, if and how do I create that as a career? And at the time, there wasn't loads of examples of younger choreographers kind of doing that as a career. There was more examples of, that becoming a dancer first, having a long career, maybe moving into teaching and then choreography. So at that time, it was sort of, I didn't know it was possible because I didn't see any examples of that. But I sort of tried to find a way to make it happen. And luckily there was a few opportunities early on that became a bit of a springboard. And then I sort of went after that.
So just to clarify, did you actually dance as a professional dancer anywhere? Or what was your first professional engagement as a choreographer?
Yeah, well, so in terms of dancing, I did a few projects here and there, but not with a major established company. And I remember really, really clearly because I did a few auditions just before I was graduating, and I remember really clearly going to I'm pretty sure it was in France somewhere, and going to this audition as a dancer to get into this company. I think because I felt like I should probably do that. And I remember halfway through, one of the people on the panel sort of came up in the break before the next round, and she came up to me and she sort of said, are you a dancer or are you a choreographer?" And I was kind of taken aback. So I thought, gosh, what a strange thing to say. I've just done class. I've not, done anything. But what became clear after is that on the CV, which at that time just sort of gave into them in, a piece of paper, everything I was proud of, everything that I had articulated, the way I described myself and the successes, were all the creative things, were all my creative endeavors or choreographic projects. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment where I was like, actually, what I want to do is to choreograph. So I stopped doing auditions and started to figure out how I could do that. And one of the early opportunities I had was with the Royal Ballet of Flanders, which I remember seeing a few years prior to that at SAD as well, thinking, my gosh, this company is just, amazing. And then I found myself there a couple of years later, creating with the company. And, it was amazing because I think I was 19 or around 19 at the time. And I remember going, and I don't know why, I think it was just a scheduling thing, but for the first few days, I had like the whole company. So there's about 50 people in this studio, in Antwerp, which I'd never been to before. And, principals, soloists, everybody in between, just sort of looking at this 19-year-old. And I remember thinking to myself, this is a bit of a make or break moment, like a lot of pressure, a lot of excitement. And I remember sort of saying to myself, what are you going to do? And I loved it. I love the pressure of that. I love you know, often as somebody at the front of the room, whatever that might look like, there's a point where you know if you've sort of got people on board, if they're with you, if they're believing in what you're doing, and that happened in that moment. And again, it sort of gave me the confidence and the excitement just to want to do more. So I'll always be incredibly grateful for that opportunity. And I think because I started choreographing quite young, so there, the Royal Ballet of Flanders, I was 19, and I got to work with really fantastic dancers, like some principal dancers, some soloist dancers. And I feel like I learned so much from them. You know, I do think choreography is an exchange, it's a conversation. And I just learned so much. And so early on, which was incredible.
I mean, that does sound quite daunting. I must say, just a tad. Um, but the fact that it mentally you decided I'm going to go for it. This is my make or break moment, rather than completely collapsing under the pressure, must have been an indication to you that you could cope with that sort of thing, and it was
Yeah,
the first step. Now, something
yeah,
else happened shortly after that. I think it was shortly after that. You came back to the UK having had a very positive experience. And I think it was the National Youth Ballet contacted you and asked you to do a full length ballet, which,
yeah.
yeah, it was based on Joanne Harris's Chocolat.
Chocolat. Yeah. So actually that was before. I was still in school when I did that, which was quite amazing. So that it was the year before. So so Chocolat became even before Royal Ballet Flanders. And this was amazing. I had danced with National Youth Ballet, I think a few years before that. And Jill Tukey, who was the founder and director, was so incredibly supportive to me. And I remember going to her house and pitching Chocolat. And she was so amazing because, you know, so we spoke about it and I showed her the book and I sort of had all of these ideas and was talking about it would be amazing. And there's also the film, which is a great reference, and music from the film, which was so good. And after we had this, you know, discussion and I sort of pitched the idea, I remember she went over to her computer and she sort of deleted some things that she provisionally put in the program, and then she just wrote Chocolat. And it's like, you know, she made the decision to commit to it there and then, which was just amazing. And later we ended up going to Rachel Portman, who wrote the music for the film, the very famous music composer. We went to Rachel's house and said, you know, we're thinking of doing this ballet. We'd love to use your music. How do you feel about that? And she was incredible, and she gave all of these additional bits of music which never made it to the film, and sort of just said, you know, enjoy, and you know, fully support you. And she helped us with the rights and all of that side of things as well. So it was just this incredible learning experience. And Jill had a design background, so she sort of designed the costumes and really mentored and involved me through that whole process. And I was 18, and then it was on Sadler's Wells main stage, which again was a real kind of pinch me moment. And it was a cast, I think, of about 45 people. So I got that kind of experience of working with a large cast and set. There was some set scenic elements and costume, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
I think we're going to hear about quite a few pinch me moments, but we'll get to those as we go along. Now, after that, so yes, National Youth Ballet, then Antwerp. Then after that, you were commissioned by various different places like the Royal Ballet School, English National
Yeah,
Ballet School. I think even the Royal Ballet, did you do something for them?
yeah,
And
yeah.
Joffrey, you've done a couple of things, have you, for them? And
Yes, yeah.
and Tulsa Ballet. We'll come back to Tulsa in a minute. But you also, quite early on, you spent some time at the New York Choreographic Institute, and you found that very inspirational. Tell me a bit about that.
Inspirational is the word. It was, I remember I'd never been to New York before. It was my first time going to New York. And so I arrived, and I think because of the flight, I arrived in New York about 1 a.m. in the morning. So my first experience in New York, it was pitch dark and all of the lights were on. And I remember arriving and seeing that skyline and being, so excited that someone had paid for me to come to New York to choreograph. I thought it was a dream. It was really a dream. And then on the first day, going to Lincoln Center and into the studios and walking past all of these, pictures of Balanchine on the wall, and feeling the sort of the weight and the responsibility and the wow, okay, this needs to be good. And the amazing thing about the Institute was, so the times that I did it, I worked with dancers from New York City Ballet, and they are so incredibly quick. I mean, they're so fast and used to not that much rehearsal and used to kind of creating new work quite quickly. And I remember we had 4 hours each day. And so on the first day, I had kind of prepared a little phrase, because you don't know any of the dancers, you don't really know where you are, you're a bit jet lagged. So I had a little movement phrase in my pocket, which I thought would take the day one, and I'd figure out what I'd do after that. And I remember looking at the clock, it was 15 minutes in and I had done the phrase, and they were like, good. And sort of just looking like, okay, what next? And I thought, my God, they're so quick. And I've still got 3 hours, 45 minutes left. What am I going to do? And it was the best thing, because that's sort of when it gets interesting. Like, I didn't have anything prepared, but I had these incredible, quick, collaborative people in front of me who knew what they were doing. So again, I sort of felt like I was learning from them in terms of, okay, this is a very different pace. And the intensity, I mean, I think the theme is like, there's an intensity to those situations and a pressure, which I think I really thrive at, like, certainly really enjoy. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, what are you going to do for the next 3 hours? And somehow you just do one thing and that leads to another thing, and so on and so forth. And I was really very grateful that I got to do that again quite early on, because that experience, once you get through it, shows you that you can go into a room and create something. It might not be good, but you don't have to use it, but you'd sort of develop that muscle and that skill to be able to create, jet lagged with people you've just met, with Balanchine's portrait looking at you on this skyscraper, on the 50th floor, whatever it is. So it was fantastic. And what was really, really wonderful as well, which doesn't always happen, is so it's usually 3 choreographers that are selected for each session. And it was really, really, really wonderful to spend time with also the other choreographers, after the rehearsals. And they were often older than me, had more experience, or had done more because they were older. And I learned so much and built some really important friendships from that, which was just amazing.
So this is slightly off piece, but I'm just curious personally to know if, when you came back in the next day and you'd had time to digest what had happened to you and the speed at which you had to work, whether you just thought, oh, I'm going to have to change all of that, or whether you thought, I've got a really good basis here for growing the piece.
Yeah, I think I was a little bit in shock, to be honest, because I think, by the end of that first day, we had created quite a lot. And then I think, you know, that evening they also, the other great thing is they arrange, you know, various trips to the theatre or a gallery or a tour. So I think we might have had one free evening in that whole 2 or 3 weeks because they had arranged all of these activities. So typically, like when I choreograph, you know, you do a 4 hour rehearsal, you need to take a breath, and you might need a bit of quiet time or something after. And that's not sort of how it works there. So I guess what I'm saying is I didn't have that much time to think. And in a way, that was sort of the interesting challenge of that experience. There wasn't much time to kind of go back at the end of the day, you know, take a few hours and then review everything. You know, unless you stay up until 3 a.m., which does happen sometimes. But it was just a very different kind of experience of not being able to kind of overthink, but very much kind of go with instincts. And I think that was the lesson there. It was about leaning in and trusting instincts. And also in that particular context, it's very much about the music, you know, because it's part of their tradition. It's like there's a language that they speak, which is very much in relation to music and architecture and pattern and geometry. So once you sort of tap into that, you figure out which language you're speaking in a way, which was fascinating because I hadn't experienced that before.
It does sound incredible, and we will talk a bit more in a minute about music and your connection to music, because I think that is a big driver in how you work, how you create stuff. But you told me once that it was after that and the experience of realizing that people could come together, and you realized that in New York they were open to doing smaller things, experimental things, that you could gather dancers together and so on and so forth. And that was part of the inspiration for setting up your McNicol Ballet Collective. So tell me a bit about that.
I think I've lost you for a second there.
Shall I just
Are we
repeat?
back?
Yes. Yes. I don't know. You
Yes,
froze for a minute.
I think I got it. Yeah.
Now we're both moving. So I just want, I just wanted to know how that situation where you were watching how it operated in New York and how lots of people were creating in different spaces, and how that
Yeah.
inspired you to create the McNicol Collective.
Yeah. I think because as part of that New York Choreographic Institute, we were going and seeing so much, I really had the impression that, you know, it seemed like all of these different artists, dancers, choreographers, musicians were coming together somehow, you know, very easily. I'm sure they didn't feel that like that, but that was my impression. And it was so exciting, and so it felt like it had a lot of energy, and, you know, dancers from New York City Ballet and American Ballet Theatre coming together and doing something. It really, my perception was that there was just this ability to come together, this mixing pot, and to make new work, and to do it with some urgency. And I was really, really inspired by that. And I think that's part of what made me start to think, gosh, I wonder if we could do something like that in the UK. I wonder if there could be more of that here as well. And so then when I came back, I sort of did a little bit of a pilot project to see, one, if dancers would be interested, and two, if you know, some donors would be interested in supporting that and helping make that happen, something we could build over time. And then there's a really positive response from that. And so that's when I sort of went about figuring, okay, this is really exciting. There seems to be some momentum and interest beyond just me. Can't just be about, you know, me, but that there's interest from other artists as well. And then I got, very serious about, okay, how do we make this happen? Because it's a great idea, but it's quite hard to actually do it in reality. And I think that's sort of what I've learned. There's a whole creativity to all of the things outside of the studio, whether it's the McNicol Ballet Collective or it's the, pitching to directors from companies all over the world. There's a real creativity to the work a choreographer has to do outside of the studio as well as inside of the studio. And that has been a really fascinating journey building the collective. We celebrated our 5th year anniversary this year, which I don't know where 5 years has gone. But I'm really proud of that, because it has become this place to bring artists together to make new work and then share that with as many people as possible. And it's that different mix of artists and composers and dancers that have different experience. It's that exchange which is so exciting and dynamic, and that I think is fair to say was triggered from my experience in New York. It just like, okay, this might be possible. Let's give it a go. Let's try.
You have said.
So yeah, I have. Yeah.
Sorry, you have said previously that you think collaborating makes you a better choreographer. What do you mean by that? Can you hear me?
Yes, I think there's a little bit of a delay, but
Yeah.
Talking about collaboration.
And it makes you a better choreographer. That's something you've said in the past.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think it's really, really true. I mean, the thing that I love so much about choreography is that I like people. I enjoy conversing and exchanging with people, and I'm interested in what moves people and what motivates people. And the more conversations I get to have, particularly with collaborators, and sort of getting inside their mind a little bit as to how they're thinking about something, and having that conversation, for me, that's what's so kind of rich and interesting about the process. So I think collaborators help you see something in a different way, or from a different perspective, or often use a different language. So for example, lighting designers, they tend to talk in language which is perhaps akin to architecture and structures, and contain spaces which expand and contract. And so it's the language they use is very architectural. Or costume designers typically talk a lot about color and the symbolism of color, and shape as it relates to the form of the body and the silhouette of the costume. And so I think part of it's not just the exchange of artistic ideas, but it's the exchange of language and how we talk about the same, building this world that we're making together, but have slightly different language and expressions of describing, sometimes the same thing. And that kind of, again, sort of helps to see it in a new way. Which is amazing, because you sort of learn there's so many ways to see the same thing, or to read multiple meanings from, we're both looking at the same thing. And for me, that's like endlessly fascinating, and I think makes the work that we create richer. But also, as for me as an audience member, when I go and see something, I have a new way of seeing as well, because I've had a conversation. The lighting is more obvious, or I'm aware of different things, which enhances my pleasure of watching as well as creating.
Well, I guess it's the whole picture that, you're in your little creative zone doing your steps and whatever, and then suddenly someone's coming in and saying, but this is what it's actually going to look like on stage, which is a wake-up call, really.
Totally. And I do think, I've always sort of like creating ballets as it's a world. You're really creating a world, and it's not just like one ingredient, not just the costume, not just the choreography, not just the music, but I think the meaning comes from how those things relate, how they speak to each other, how they if they're serving the same idea or the same message. And that's really fascinating. That's really interesting. And of course, as you said, like sometimes you don't really see it until the last moment, you know, the day before the show when everything actually comes together. And that's of course where things make sense or don't make sense or look totally different than they looked in the studio, or you know, and there are kind of tools and tricks to, you know, now like for example, you know, in the studio being quite close to the choreography, to the dancers is what is one thing, and then the moment that you create distance or a higher perspective, it looks very different, or things don't read, um or seeing it from a different angle, you know, deliberately moving where I'm sat in the studio so I see something from a different perspective. So along the way you sort of learn these tools and these tricks, but it is still that scary moment where everything comes together and it's, you know, there's not that much time to change or to fix, which again is sort of terrifying and exciting all at the same time, you know.
Yes, I can imagine. Now I'm just going to take a leap across the Atlantic, and because you were not so long ago, a couple of years ago, you were commissioned to do a full-length Cinderella for Tulsa Ballet, which is obviously, it's an incredible thing. I mean, Cinderella especially, because people know the story, it's a fairy tale, and so on and so forth. But tell me what it felt like to be going to a big company, an established company, being invited to do a full length, which is quite a step up for a young choreographer to have to take that on board. And tell me what you learned from that experience.
Yeah, I remember. So I had created a few shorter pieces for Tulsa Ballet, so I was familiar with the company, and I remember I was on holiday and I got a call from the director. I saw my phone ringing and I saw it was the director, and he offered me the full length, and he actually he mentioned three titles, and out of the three that he was looking to do, I said, for me, Cinderella is actually the only one of those three that I would be interested in doing. And so, and I remember not straight away, but once we sort of got into the process, he said, you know, Cinderella for Tulsa Ballet, but also for a lot of American companies, after Nutcracker, is the highest grossing box office. And of course, a lot of companies in America rely on box office success. So in other words, it has to be a success. And I kind of love him for being so candid and honest about it. But I also felt the weight of responsibility, not just to do a great job, you know, artistically, but there was a real investment from the company in this being a success. And you know, I think the interesting thing with a full length also is companies have to invest quite a lot up front, particularly with a story ballet, and particularly with a classic like Cinderella. We had all new sets, all new costumes. So what that means in reality is that it will stay in the company's repertoire for at least 15 years, because they're going to have to, you know, perform it that many times. And that's a really interesting challenge artistically when you think, with something like Cinderella, how do you know, how do we create something that feels fresh and that makes sense for today, and hopefully also still kind of feel, um you know, and the world is always changing. So it's an interesting, when you kind of start thinking before you've created any steps, you know, being aware of those things. And it's interesting, as you said, with Cinderella, um I think everybody sort of holds a different memory or association. You know, some people know the Disney, some people know the beautiful books from their childhood. And I think what that means is, so on the good thing is that people know the story, which is helpful. But the challenge is that people love different aspects of it, and they have these you know, images and associations that they want to see when they go and see a Cinderella. And so the challenge is, how do you hopefully give enough of that so you give audiences those things that they love about Cinderella and that they want to see and expect, but then also you know, update it a little bit and find, you know, for example, I was really interested in who is the prince. You know, we learn a lot about Cinderella through the story, but who is this person? Who is the prince? What's his story? And why is he deserving of Cinderella's love? You know, if Cinderella is kind of modeling all of these amazing attributes that, you know, the best qualities of humanity: kindness, generosity, understanding, empathy. Who's the prince, and why is he deserving of her love if she's so amazing? And so I was interested because I did feel like there were some gaps in terms of the story. And, you know, coming from the UK and our history of theatre and storytelling, and a lot of my early works were narrative driven, for me, it was a really fantastic opportunity to kind of bring together everything I'd learned from the shorter story ballets I'd done before, like Chocolat and Kreutzer Sonata and others, and then sort of the more abstract works I'd done in terms of developing my vocabulary and language and ability to communicate with dancers. And it felt like this amazing opportunity to kind of bring all of that learning together. And Marcello Angelini, the director, really kind of mentored me through that process. Interestingly, they've commissioned a lot of choreographers to create their first full lengths. They've got a bit of a track record of that, which is like Edward Liang, for example, and others. So yeah, incredible.
And I can't remember if you've told me this, but has it been revived since your first, since it was premiered?
So it premiered in 2023, and it will come back very soon. I don't know if I can, and you know, it might be next year. Let's say it's there. It will be coming back soon, which is really, you know, really exciting because, you know, it will be a few years on, and of course, there's always things you want to tweak and to refine, and that's what I love about coming back to something.
Yes. So I'm going to take you back to a recent experience where you were in Portugal with the National Ballet of Portugal, and you had done a piece called Upstream. And you have to explain what the triple bill was that it was on, and how you were invited back just a year later, and what that experience was like, and whether there were different dancers, or whether you wanted to change things when you'd had a bit of a gap, a bit of time to step back and see it afresh.
Yeah, I mean, this really was another pinch me moment, because I remember going over there to start creating the piece, and at the time, just about a year or a year and a half ago, but at the time, the company's building was being renovated. So the company was in another studio, basically in the center of Lisbon. And because of that, the performance was at the San Carlo Opera House, which is, for anyone who knows the movie White Nights with Baryshnikov and that scene in the studio, it's there at San Carlo. And it's just such a beautiful opera house with, I think, the largest rake in Europe. So it's like 6 degrees rake. So the dancers were panicking a little bit about that, and, you know, understandably so. But I remember one day after the rehearsals, just kind of walking by the front of San Carlo Opera House, and they were, of course, advertising the show. And the program, it was a triple bill, and it was Balanchine, McNicol, and Forsythe. And I just remember I was just kind of it stopped me for a second, because I remember looking at the front of San Carlo and seeing my name sandwiched between, you know, Balanchine and Forsythe, these absolute legends and icons, um, in this beautiful opera house, in this beautiful country and city. And it wasn't lost on me um, what that meant and how important that was, and it felt like another sort of milestone. And I had such a wonderful time there, creating that piece. And it's interesting because I always, where possible, and I think I make my best work when it lands like this, but I really like to go to a company, sort of create the piece ahead of time, let some time go by, and then go back, you know, 3 weeks before it's going to be performed. And then kind of, I've got a bit of perspective and ability to finesse and to look at it with fresh eyes. And also it sits in the dancer's body a little bit longer. And it just so happened that was the structure of the rehearsals. And it was fantastic. And so it was performed there in San Carlo. And then in February of this year, they brought the piece back, and it was part of the opening program for their theatre, which had just been renovated, which was very different. You know, San Carlo's gold and beautiful, and their theatre is more kind of modern and a little bit bigger, flat stage, which was very appreciated by the dancers. Um, and so you do tweak things when it moves to a different space. Because I do think the frame through which you look at something can often change, you know, the meaning of what you're looking at. In the same way that if you go to a gallery and you have this huge space and these white walls and there's one picture, the space around that picture confers importance and significance to it because it's holding all of this space. So it changes your relationship with what you're looking at. And I think that's true of different theatres. You know, if you see a performance that has a beautiful gold proscenium, it sets up an expectation and frames something in a very particular way. If you go to a more modern theatre, that's sort of, you know, black box feeling, that has a different associations. So it's interesting. It's helpful to know that in advance, as well as the scale of something. Because I've done things in the past where, you know, it moves to a larger theatre and it just doesn't read, or there are certain gestures or important moments which I think, gosh, that was so clear and so obvious in the studio, and now we're in the theatre in a large auditorium. It's lost, and that's really interesting learning and constant. You know, if a piece goes to a different company or a different theatre, those things are very much, I think one has to be quite attuned to that and to change and to tweak, even if there isn't much time or people don't want changes. You know, sometimes it's really important.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to come back to the UK again. And I wanted to ask you, you've just done this wonderful new creation called Liquid Life, which you have performed as part of your 5-year anniversary celebrations. And that has also been a really interesting journey for you because, and it'd be interesting to hear a bit about the process of this. You commissioned a score, and that is a whole different thing from hearing a piece of music by Tchaikovsky or whatever and thinking, well, that would make a great ballet. So
Yeah.
tell me about the differences in the process of creating that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things with the collective that I always think about is, and I think about this in different companies. I always think, what piece can I create with the collective that I can't create with Joffrey Ballet, or what kind of piece can I create with Joffrey Ballet that I can't create with the collective, or whatever it might be. And there's a few different things, and one of the things was that I really wanted to commission a score, and you know, so much of my work, but also the work that's been developed through the collective has been about the music and dance relationship, or musically driven work. And so in the summer, last summer, we did a wonderful project for guest choreographers and composers to come together in a creative lab and experiment with music and choreography. And as part of that, Jeremy Birchall was the mentor. And so he was mentoring the composers and I was mentoring the choreographers. And of course, we had so many conversations over dinner, you know, before, during that whole period, about what makes great music for dance and what are some of those nuances and things that are specific to dance, and how do you create that in today's world and the challenges and the, you know, the financing of it. So it, like the artistic, and then but how do you actually do it, and if you want it to be live, what's the scale of orchestra that's achievable. And so we had all of these conversations through that summer program, and then at the end of it I said, you know, I called Jeremy a few weeks afterwards and I was like, we need to like do this. We need to not just, you know, we've had so many conversations, like we sort of need to put our money where our mouth is and do it. And that aligned with the 5th year anniversary of the collective. And so it was amazing because, as you say, when you have a piece of music, it suggests a map. You know, there's a point A and a point B and everything that happens in between. So you've got a map, which of course you can counterpoint. You don't necessarily follow always exactly what the music is doing. There's something tangible there, that map, before kind of hearing anything. And so the conversations start becoming about emotional world of the beginning is, and crucially, how do we get from there to the next idea or the next scene or the next movement. And it's fascinating because then you sort of get into conversations around, well, how long does an idea last before we've understood it and we can kind of move on? And so, you know, does this section need to be 5 minutes? Does it need to be 1 minute? Is it a whole scene or is it a transition? As well as the emotional color and flavor of it. And that was really fascinating, and of course happening a little bit in advance of the creation, but then also very much evolving as I was creating the choreography in the studio. So Jeremy created kind of little nuggets of each section, and I would kind of go in the studio and start creating, and then it would sort of fill out and build from there. And then some things we cut and got rid of completely, and some things we expanded. And we had 4 live musicians as well, which was fantastic. And it's quite interesting because so we had 4 live musicians who were playing live, but part of the score was also pre-recorded as well. And so, you know, figuring out the technology of what the musicians have in their ear and how they coordinate with the pre-recorded elements and when they're solo was a whole, you know, there's a whole technical side of that, which I'm not the most technical person. So there's a lot of learning, a lot of learning there for me. But I think it meant that we were able to have the intimacy of live music. We had 4 musicians, but then also the scale and the power of some pre-recorded elements, which I think which we've sort of become accustomed and used to, and felt like we wanted that scale also because of the idea of the piece of Liquid Life. So fascinating, and I think that sort of illustrates the point before about collaborators making me a better choreographer, because talking about structure and how long an idea lasts and how do you get from one idea to the other in a way that makes sense and it isn't just a sort of immediate jump. It's really interesting to try to talk those things through and then actually do them in real life. Yeah.
So I'm interested to know if you have ever had, or if you regularly have, moments of complete panic and sort of, oh my God, what am I going to do with this bit of music, or whether you're so in tune with how you work with your dancers that you don't have an issue with that. I would be terrified of going into a studio and trying to even take class, I think, or teach class. But so you know, you're standing there with all these faces waiting. They're waiting for you to do something creative and make it on them. So how do you get through that?
Yeah, I think I've evolved, you know, the more I do. Certainly at the beginning, I mean, going back to that Royal Ballet of Flanders moment when there's people there looking at, you know, 50 people in a room looking at you, it can be terrifying. But I think I don't think, perhaps not panic, because I do really see choreography as something we do together. Like you know, unless I choreograph on myself, which I'm not particularly interested in doing, I need other bodies and space and music to just to practice, to just do something. So it's not panic because it's something that we're doing together, and I genuinely think, you know, we're in a room, and depending how many people, you know, there's either 2 minds or 4 minds or 5 minds. It's, you know, what we're all looking for is the best idea, and sometimes a bad idea leads to a good idea, or an average idea leads to the next idea, which finally gets to where we need to be. So I think as I've got older, and I think the more I choreograph, is for myself, I sort of frame it a bit like a muscle. You know, it's practice. And because of the New York experience, there's a confidence in that I know that I can go into a studio with dancers with more or less preparation and make something. It might not be good and we might not use it in the end, but after a period of time and after practice, you know how to work. And I think there's something in those experiences of like trusting the work and the discipline and the rigor of just keep working, just keep in the same way that, you know, an artist might just keep sketching, and it might take them 5 attempts to get to it, but sometimes you just have to keep going. And I think that's how I think of those if ever I'm having a moment where I'm sort of feeling a bit lost or not sure, those are the moments that I just sort of just keep going. A bit like that, you know, New York experience where it's like you've got 3 hours, 45 minutes left. Just keep going. And maybe through that, over that time, something interesting will come out, and then that leads to the next thing, or it doesn't, and you just scrap it the next day, which is painful for everybody because who wants to scrap their work. But I think I trust that process, and I trust that we're gonna get to the answer together. So it's not just about me, and that I think enables me to just keep moving forward, to keep working, and and get to a moment where we do have something that's interesting or working, or that's going or leading in the direction that the piece wants. And I think that's the other thing. As I've got older, I try to sort of remove myself a little bit, in the sense that I always try to ask the question, what does the piece need? So instead of it being about, come on, Andrew, like do something interesting, I try to think about it as, you know, what does this piece need? What's missing? If something isn't working, that's information. What is that? Or what's the opposite to that? Let's try that. And so there are these kind of techniques, in a way, to not be stuck, but to kind of come at something in another way. And you just keep going through that process. Also, humor really helps. You know, sometimes it's like, oh, that's terrible, isn't it? Like that doesn't work, you know. And and you know, dancers know when something doesn't work. They know when something's great. Choreographers, and sometimes I think just being kind of candid or honest about, yeah, no, that doesn't work. Let's try something else. It just, I think, builds trust, and it's just honest, and gets people involved as well. Like I think, as I said before, I do see choreography like an exchange, like a conversation, and therefore, if if I'm not overflowing with ideas one day, there might be somebody else in the room who's, just because of their mood or temperament, is suggesting something, and that energy can send you in another direction, which could be really interesting. So I try to stay open to the surprise also. Don't have to have all of the answers, but I remember a mentor said that to me once, like, just stay open to the surprise. Like, you've got your plan and your kind of idea and vision and the trajectory of where you think the piece is going, but also, like, something else might come up along the way that is a surprise, but might be more interesting, and just being open to that. And, you know, that's like a constant practice. It's hard. It's how I try to frame it for myself.
So I'm also interested to know, because your own collective, you don't necessarily have the same dancers every time it comes around, although you seem to have some constants in there. A Winnie Diaz is always, or Diaz, I don't know. And you've got your faithfuls who will come back. What's it like having to adjust to new personalities, new dancers coming from different places in the world with different training and stuff, and trying to bring them into the way you work?
Yeah, I think it's I think part of the job of a choreographer, and in the case of the collective, a director, is about building teams. And whether that's for all of the work outside of the studio with the collective or inside of the studio, it's I spend a lot of my time thinking about what that dynamic might be. And particularly in the case of the collective, it's quite a small group. This season we had 8 dancers, and the smaller the group, in some ways it's crucial that everybody sort of plays their role and steps up to the plate and really contributes something, because there is nowhere to hide, and there isn't another person sort of waiting in the wings. So it's one of the key things that I spend a lot of my time reflecting on, because it's how those different personalities and qualities that the dancers have will contribute to the whole. And that's fascinating. And when you get that right, the beautiful thing is that, as you say, everybody's coming with different experiences and schoolings, and also different stages of their career. So Winnie's already had a very successful career, and then we also had some dancers who were sort of at the beginning of their journey. And when you get that mix right, you see the exchange happening. For example, like over the lunch break, you see one of the dancers helping somebody else figure something out, or with their line, or showing them a new stretch they figured out, or saying, when you do this, think about that. And it's just those moments that you kind of see in the corner of your eye, but it's so beautiful. And it really, I love it when I see that, because it shows that we're all working towards the same thing, which is that we want to create and to present the most compelling, highest quality work that we can all be proud of, because we've all put everything into it. And so it's part of who you bring into the space. But then I think also, certainly with the collective, because I can control or design that in some ways, I do try to set up an atmosphere where dancers feel like they're able to put forth their ideas. We might go with it, we might not, but it's that kind of that exchange which I was talking about before, and for everybody to know that that's what we're after, that's what we want. And when that's right, it's such a pleasure. And it's a constant thing, you know, you have to constantly kind of keep an eye on it. But yeah, yeah.
And in this program that you've just done, you brought back Bates Beats of Silence, and what was the other one?
Moonbend.
Moonbend, yes.
Yeah.
And how did it feel bringing those back? Because some of them were earlier pieces, and they obviously had a significance because you wanted them to be on this special program. So
Yeah.
tell me the significance of that.
Yeah, I think I really wanted, you know, 5 years growing and building the collective for 5 years, you know, hasn't been easy. And what I wanted was to kind of show and share the pieces that sort of helped us get to this point. And so, for example, Of Silence has a really interesting journey. It was originally started as a pas de deux for Will Bracewell and Delia Matthews back at a workshop at Birmingham Royal Ballet. And then it was extended into a full piece. And then for this program, we did it as the pas de deux, which is, you know, changed a little bit, but it was, you know, that's sort of where it all started. And what was really beautiful is Will Bracewell came and coached that pas de deux a little bit as well, and because it was originally created on him. And so that felt important. That piece felt important because it sort of started it. It was really the very beginning, one of the very first things that we did. And we got to have the live choir as well, which is something I really wanted to do for a long time. So it felt important that that was represented in this 5 year sort of milestone. And then Moonbend was a piece that we had done last season, and very different in terms of its musical genre and its energy. And so it you know, it was also, you know, thinking about winners. And, you know, I think that's what's so interesting when you have a whole evening, particularly when it's your own work, you know, how to keep that kind of interesting. And the three pieces that were in the first act that were already existing were very different in terms of music, very different in terms of costume and color and design. And I sort of wanted to showcase what we had achieved so far. And then the second act would be future, which is live music, commission score, you know, beautiful costumes, that really all of the ingredients being important. So it was really a way to kind of say, this is where we've come from, and celebrating where we've come from. This is sort of where we're heading. And it felt like the right moment to do that in what was our 5th year anniversary.
So obviously that was a big milestone, as you say. What about the next 5 years? How far ahead do you have to plan? I mean, I know that when you work with very big companies, it's 2 or 3 years in advance. It's just,
Yeah.
you know, it's incredible. But with your own collective, are you already thinking what you're going to do in 2028 and so on and so forth? What's that like?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because so for this first 5 years, we had, you know, I created a whole 5 year plan and what we wanted to do. And so now we're just finessing the plan for the next 5 years, knowing that things change, the world is changing. It's you know, having a plan but being able to adapt and to respond quite quickly. which I think is one of the strengths of the collective. I mean, we can plan and build longer term projects, but if opportunities come up at a shorter notice, we can respond to that too. And that's, I think, been one of its strengths. You know, we've performed in Latitude, we've also gone to France, and we've been able to do that because we can move quite quickly, because, you know, we can scale up or scale down depending on the opportunity. So I have my plan and what I would love to achieve in the next 5 years. But I also have 5 years of experience now building the collective and knowing what some of the real challenges are. And that's really interesting because, you know, when you found something and you just kind of go for it, you've got all of that wonderful kind of naive energy and you just sort of find your way through. And then you're like, oh God, I didn't think about that. Or that's a bit tricky. How are we going to solve that? And then, you know, now I know what those challenges are. It's sort of like how to design the next projects and programs and productions with that knowledge, but also not losing that kind of, yeah, but let's just go for it, because you don't want to get bogged down with the challenges. But I think for the collective, you know, we have conversations with theatres at least a year, 2 years in advance, and aligning their scheduling, and then aligning the schedules of the dancers, and then of course raising the funds to resource it, which takes time. You know, a lot of trusts and foundations, or there's lead times, and then there's decision making times. So once you factor all of that in, there's kind of like multiple schedules and lead times for things, which you kind of have to put together a bit like a jigsaw, and they don't always fit together. So you've got to move some things earlier or some things a bit later. And that's just kind of, that depends on so many factors. Which is why I say I've got my plan. I know what I would love to do tomorrow. You know, it's funny because I thought when I first started the collective, all that we've achieved in this 5 years, I thought we would have done in 2 originally, you know, and then I realized, oh no, it takes a bit of time to get everything together. So, you know, that's how I think about it now.
Yeah, and plus we've also had a pandemic in between.
A pandemic, a Brexit, a cost of living, you know, all of these things. So yeah.
Excellent. So I think, unless Susan tells me otherwise, I might ask you a few questions from the chat. From Jane, she asks, what brought you and your collective to Thornhill? The reason I ask is that I live nearby.
I missed the first part of that question.
What brought you and your collective to Thornhill?
Yes.
Yeah, because she lives nearby.
Ah, okay. We must come and say hello. So
and I'm not sure you heard the first bit of the question. How did you end up going to Thornhill?
no, it just cut out. And
oh dear. I'll try again. What brought you and the collective to Thornhill? How did you get there? Why did you go there?
So that's So Thornhill, this base is that's really where the company's office essentially is, because it's based there. And also when I founded the collective, as you said, there was a pandemic going on, and so that's where I was at that time, and you know, often moving around. So it's just that really.
Right. I hope that answers the question, Jane. And from Keith, can choreography be taught, or is it just a skill you are born with?
I I think there's, you know, I think there are techniques which you can learn, um, and there are things that you can, you know, you can study. I think you can learn craft. You know, I think you can learn craft and technique, and I think you can study and learn from watching other choreographers and analyzing the work, and then getting in a studio and practicing. Um, and then I think coupled with that, there's probably, like many things, I think there has to be some kind of instinct, um, desire, motivation, commitment, dedication that is an important piece of that. Um, some talent or affinity to it might also play a part. And then, as I said before, I think for anybody who wants to choreograph today, um, there's also like a creativity that you have to develop outside of the studio, particularly early on. Like there's a creativity to how do you get yourself in a studio with dancers and music, because just to practice, because all of those resources cost money and require time and money just to practice. So I think there's kind of, you have to kind of choreograph your way into opportunities and studios to be able to practice, and then with that, you know, learn about the craft and learn from others. So I think it's a mix. I think it's a mix.
I must say I would agree with that completely. So the next question is from Susan. When you are creating work for the students of a ballet school, how does the process differ from working with experienced professional dancers, or is there a difference?
Really interesting. Very different. Very different. I think for students, I think when you're creating a piece for students, there's also an element, or there's more an element also of teaching how. So, for example, when you're working with dancers, professional dancers who have been through, you know, multiple creative processes with different choreographers, they often quite quickly tap into what you're after, or there's a confidence because there's an experience with kind of suggesting or kind of giving themselves in a way that students have to some degree, but there's a bit of teaching that goes alongside that, and learning about how to collaborate. And so when I create a piece for a school, I also, as I go through the process, I try to sort of mirror back to them what's helpful, or how from the front of a room, how you respond can be perceived. Because I think that's something I've realized, you know, working in schools or just being in a studio, when you're at the front of the room, everything is totally visible. You know, if you're 100% there, if you're not, if you're, all of those things become really visible, and it's important to know that. And unless somebody tells you, or can kind of show you through a process, you don't necessarily know. So I think for students, there's a whole kind of learning piece that goes alongside the process that isn't to the same degree when creating with, you know, professional dancers. And I enjoy both, because a lot of what I remember or have to kind of articulate to students about how to do something, or how to think about something, serves me really well in terms of communicating, or sort of refreshing my eye when I'm working with professionals, and vice versa. You know, working with professionals, sometimes they suggest things that I would never have thought about, and I can kind of share that with students. So I really love being able to do both, because I think I can add a lot of value between both.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, actually, that, you know, they sort of
Mm,
work well with each other. So I have a
yeah.
question here from Fiona, who would like to know, do you have a wish list of narrative stories and or music pieces you'd like to create too?
I do. I've had a list and a book from since I was like 16 years old. Um, so yeah, and it's interesting because with the music, for example, I have a whole list of music, and my test is always like whether I come back to something. So usually whenever I choreograph, I've probably lived with that music for at least a year, if not longer. So before I really think about choreographing, it's already kind of in my body, in my ears. So I have a list of music and stories, and it's really, I think what I've come to learn is it's trying to find the right match. So different companies, different countries, different cultures, different scales of opportunities or lengths of creation periods, so they kind of lend themselves to different stories or music. And so when an opportunity comes up, I often think, okay, out of this, I go to my list and I think, you know, which might work best in this setting, or if a gala opportunity comes up, it needs to be a certain length. So I kind of have my list, and then depending on the opportunity or company, think, okay, what would that company do really well, or what would that dancer be amazing? I have some pieces that I imagine particular dancers doing. I have some pieces I imagine particular companies doing, and then there are some stories which I think would work well in certain cities and probably not so well in others. So that's why I like to have the list, so I'm sort of prepared and ready for if and when those conversations come up. I can kind of, I've already got a few things up my sleeve.
Excellent. I just want to say that Jane says, thank you for satisfying my curiosity about the Thornhill thing. So,
my pleasure.
So, right, I think unless anyone else has got another question, please go ahead if you've suddenly thought of something. But otherwise, I think I might hand back to Susan, if that's all right. I'm sure she'll appear in a minute. There she is.
Hello. Great. Oh, that was absolutely fascinating. Such an easy conversation between the two of you as well, just chatting like old friends sitting around, and it's great. It makes us all feel very much a part of it. Thank you. Andrew, it must be an absolute joy to be in the studio with you. Your excitement and your enthusiasm are just infectious. I mean, I'm sitting here smiling.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it comes across in your work as well. So thank you so much for taking the time for us tonight. And Deborah, thank you. As always, a terrific interview. You always have such interesting questions and know your subject so well. So it really helps us get to know the guests. So thank you both so much. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So to those of you watching, please join us for our next In Conversation, which will be with Valentino Zucchetti from the Royal Ballet, and that's in June. Jamie Tapper from, dancer, psychologist, career development, she's involved with. She'll be our speaker in July. And wheelchair dancer Joe Powell Main will join us in August. So exciting people to also get to meet. And don't forget about the other events coming up, the visit, the rehearsal watch for Northern Ballet's Jane Eyre at Sadler's Wells next week, and visits to both Central School of Ballet and English National Ballet School coming up. So all those details are on the website. Please take a look. So thank you for joining us again, Andrew and Deborah. Thank you. It's been just a wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you both again soon. And to all of you watching, thanks for being here tonight. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.